This original WSRE presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you.
It's called a haven for tourists, also a haven for turtles. It's a place steeped in history, a constantly changing ecosystem, a laboratory for research and suntanning too. All of this at the Gulf Islands National Seashore here in our own backyard. Good evening, I'm Lloyd Patterson. A Ken Burns series on PBS gives us a close-up on a few of the nation's 400 national parks. America's Best Idea, as the PBS series is titled. The Gulf Islands National Seashore stretches 160 miles from Cat Island off the coast of Gulfport, Mississippi, all the way east to Okaloosa County, Florida. And our guests this evening know just about every inch of this national seashore. J. Earl Bowden is called the father of the Gulf Island National Seashore. He is editor emeritus of the Pensacola News-Journal, where he previously served in just about every role. He's a Florida native and author of 12 books reflecting his affection for the characters he met along his 80-year path. Gail Bishop shares Mr. Bowden's love of the National Seashore. She serves as Chief of Interpretation and Education, 20 years at the National Seashore. And David Ogden is also a historian and park interpreter working at Gulf Islands, where he's led thousands of visitors on tours of the National Seashore. And we welcome you to the program this evening, talking about one of the great assets to this part of the country. People who've come here in the last 20 years, maybe 30 years, probably figure, as we did when we came here, that this thing has always been a national preserve. But I'm telling you, there was a heck of a fight getting this thing set up and going. Earl Bowden?
It certainly was. It lasted about 5 or 6 years, pitting private enterprise versus people who thought it should be a national park. Real estate, Chamber of Commerce opposed it, WCOA radio opposed it, the News-Journal was for it, and we had one hell of a fight.
And it lasted for several years, and it was it got pretty nasty, didn't it?
It sure did, and there was accusations it was a federal land grab, that the Park Service would put a chain link fence around Santa Rosa Island. It would not be for people, it would be for wildlife. All those kinds of slurs were hurled against the park, and the Chamber of Commerce issued a negative report that was composed of really negative things about what it would become if it became a national park. And really the fight was over whether we would have local control of the beaches or whether we would make it a national park.
And I imagine those people who opposed it today feel a little bit foolish about some of their arguments. Gail?
Well, I don't know if they feel that way, but they certainly are very supportive of the National Seashore now. They realize the importance of preserving these special islands and these wonderful beaches.
David?
Well, I've lived here a long time, and one of the things that Earl had above some other folks was the ability to take the long view, because the beach wasn't nearly as developed then as it is now. And now when there's development virtually up to our borders on all sides, people can clearly see the value of the open beach and the federal protection that it's got and the value of it. So there are still some people that are stuck in their ways, but by and large, people are overjoyed to come to this place, and it is a beautiful park.
Do you think people in this area, in Northwest Florida, are familiar enough with the National Seashore and all the things it offers? It's something maybe you bring the relatives to when they come from out of town. Kids go there on tours. Do you think that the people who live here are aware of what's really is offered there?
Well, I think we have a variety of people who come to the park, and some people are certainly from the area. They buy their annual passes, but then I'll meet people who said, I've always wondered what this place was when they come to Naval Live Oaks. you know, we do have a lot of people who are constantly moving in the area and leaving, so I think some of those people might not know what all the areas that we have to offer and what we have to offer at the National Seashore.
David, do you have people that go on your tours that live in the area and say, I didn't know this was here?
Well, the folks who come to the fort where I give the tours know that there's a fort out there, but they sometimes are not aware of the jurisdiction and that it's a national park. I've actually had people come down to the fort tour who had been coming to the campground at Fort Pickens for years and had never gotten beyond the campground the extra mile down to the fort. So one of the things to keep in mind about the park is that it is so large and complex, although in a kind of compact area, that people can spend a long time enjoying a small part of it before they get out to another area to look and see. So there's one of the nice things about the National Seashore is that there's always something new to discover there, and it is an amazingly diverse place.
Yeah, we just saw a video underwater. We saw the turtles running into the ocean. There's so much wildlife that's represented at this park that's not found just on every beach in the country, and that's got to be a point of fascination for a lot of people.
I find that Fort Pickens is a much beloved spot since the road has not been open since Iving, just recently opened in the last few months. People are beginning to flock back to the fort, that they tell me they just love to go to Fort Pickens. Now, I see it from a local standpoint, but Jerry Eubanks, the superintendent, tells me visitation is among the highest among the 10 national seashores. It's Gulf Islands. It has been since it opened. So it is a national park. And one of the charms of my fight to preserve this in the long ago was the fact that the people of this region rose up and said, we want to give these forts and this portions of the island in its natural state to the American people, and that's what they did. And you're right, it was a long fight, and finally in 1971, January 8th, President Nixon signed the bill, and we began to develop the park. Within 10 years, most of the infrastructure that the Park Service had promised had been completed, because I was awfully impatient about restoring Fort Pickens and Fort Barrancas. And they said, you don't understand, Park Service don't work that fast. But in 10 years, Congressman Sykes had got most of the appropriations for the infrastructure, both here and in Mississippi.
What do people think of when they think of the Gulf Islands National Seashore? Do you think they think of Fort Barrancas? Do they think of Fort Pickens? What is it that they see as being the National Seashore? It's kind of hard to get your arms around how big this thing is, and you can't just see it in a day.
No,
David?
Not really. Well, it really depends on the type of people. Some people just want to go to get to an open beach, far away from buildings and away from other people. Other people want to come out and take a bike ride through the forest out there. I see a lot of folks who come to see the forts, and for those people who enjoy seacoast forts and the old construction, what we have at Gulf Islands is a fairly amazing collection, and Barrancas is a good one that you mentioned. The Park Service did a $1 million restoration job on that fort, and it is one of the best preserved structures of its kind in the country, and it is an amazing piece of engineering. I've been going through it for over 20 years, and I never get tired of it, and just yesterday I took a tour through it with some folks who were just overjoyed at the quality of the workmanship in it, the amount of thought that went into it. And I often get a comment from people on the tours that they're amazed that people were able to do this that long ago, which in terms of European and world history is not that long ago, but America is a fairly young country, and so we're not used to seeing things that are 170 years old and still standing.
Yeah,
you have
it was a major engineering feat to get, I'm sure, to get that thing built.
And you have at the foot of Barrancas, the Spanish, San Antonio, built by the Spanish. So you go to, David takes his tour down those steps, he goes down a couple of centuries. So that's the fascination of it, is these forts. Pickens itself is amazing. Now we all hear the stories about Geronimo was there, and that is a wonderful story. But Pickens itself is a great engineering feat to see that the way those bricks are placed into mortar and built in the 1840s. I mean, it's amazing.
And they built that thing to last, didn't they? I mean, that is, you don't see construction like that every day.
Right.
What are the walls, about 10 feet thick?
Well, from the entire wall is probably 20 feet thick. The exterior wall is actually only 4 foot thick, but it's solid brickwork. And that's the thing. It's 10 courses of brick from one side to the other, and it's 20 feet tall. It was originally 21.5 million bricks, all of them made locally. It's all Pensacola Bay clay that's in that thing.
Did they take the bricks over? Were the bricks made on site, or were they taken from Pensacola and shipped over there?
Most of the kilns were along Scenic Highway in those days. I don't know how they transported them to the island, but probably by barge or something.
That must have been a heck of an undertaking. What would have happened to these places if there would have been no national park? What happened? I mean, a fort like that is not going to just fall down.
I had an experience with Fort Pickens about that. One of the things that really just worried me to death is they had these giant metallic crutches that were holding the arches up along that area that the Park Service has put back together. That's the only thing that was holding Pickens up, and there was a structural report at the time that said if something wasn't done, Pickens would be just rubble in 25 years. So those kind of things led me in my fight to try to get it done. And within 10 years, most of that restoration, stabilization of the forts was completed, and it was an amazing job. But the thing about Gulf Islands is you got history, goes colonial history, the first Spanish settlements in that part of Fort Pickens area of the island. That's the location of it. You got that, and then you go right up to the American, go all the way up to World War II in 1945, and David's expert on that. Coast artillery, that is so important. And Fort Pickens area has always been a very popular place in Florida, in that when the state of Florida had Fort Pickens State Park, that campground, which has been devastated by Ivan and the other storm, now all the trees are gone, but that was the most popular campground in this area in those years, very popular, and it has remained so as a national park. So there's great variety to have at a visit to Gulf Islands.
Well, Gail, we'll get to you in just a moment, but as we continue here on Connecting the Community tonight, we want to introduce you to some of our HD documentary that WSRE is very proud of. Ted King, our photographer, does a wonderful job, and we want to take a look and give you a sample of this documentary that's going to be coming up soon.
There's something about a national park, when you're there, you feel like you own it, and you do. It's one of the best ideas we ever had on America.
Gulf Islands National Seashore, what you're going to see out there, I believe, is one of the the biggest fort you'll ever see in your lifetime. It's not something that you see every day. It's, if not the third, the fourth largest fort in the country. And it just has this ambiance about it. When you walk through it, you imagine the floors, how sometimes when they're uneven, you're walking really where soldiers have walked since the 1800s. You're walking through hallways that Geronimo and the Chiricahua Apaches, the chiefs, walk through. Their children. You're walking through the hallways and imagining conversations going on between soldiers during World War I or II and training out here, missing their families and working on the guns and just companionship of them all. So it's a little different. If walls could talk, sometimes that's what I say. Go through the fort, be quiet, and just go through it and listen.
Walked around and there was mockingbirds here in the structure of the park, and you know, they come around and they talk to you, and they hop into the sticker vines, which you couldn't penetrate. But if you look inside the vines, you'll see trumpet flowers. And trumpet flowers are for hummingbirds, and it's great that animals and birds and mammals can use these grounds for places of refuge.
People come out here, you know, and they're like, they're changed. They're just not, they didn't realize they could come someplace like this.
Gulf Islands National Seashore. It's a fairly unusual little area. It's kind of like a string of jewels along the central Gulf Coast. We've got 12 different areas, half of them in Florida, half of them in Mississippi. We have barrier islands, we have some mainland units, we've got outstanding natural areas, we have some outstanding historic sites, and we have some of the prettiest beaches in the world. I like to tell people we've got a little bit of everything that you find anywhere in the national park systems. We've got great natural features, great historical features, and great recreational opportunities. So what more do you need?
Gulf Islands National Seashore. If you just tuned in, you're watching Connecting the Community. I'm Lloyd Patterson. Tonight we're talking to some people who really know their way around this national preserve. Earl Bowden, who has a road named for him, and it's well deserved, at the National Seashore. He's with us this evening. We also have Gail Bishop, who has 20 years of experience at the park, and I'll call it a park, although you don't call it that. She serves as Chief of Interpretation and Education. And David Ogden is also a historian and a park interpreter, and we appreciate your being here to talk about this. You know, when I see the video like that, I think you guys must have the neatest job in the world. You're working in such a beautiful place every which way you turn. Are you so deep in the bureaucracy that you sometimes don't see the great beauty that surrounds you there?
Well, sometimes I feel like I am, but I can just walk outside and look across the bay, and I've got a great view. So I'm reminded where I work and how special the place is where I work. So I think I really appreciate it.
David, are there many seashores or even parks in the country that offer what the Gulf Islands do in terms of having everything going for it? It's got the recreational aspects, as we just saw, the ecology, wildlife.
Well, the thing about the national park system is that all of the units that are included in the national park system are really spectacular for one reason or another. Some of them are fairly small geographically. Historic houses, for instance, will just be about one particular personality, perhaps. And then you have the huge national parks, like the ones in Alaska, and of course Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon, that sort of thing, which have some historical aspects of them. But there are not very many that have all the different elements so tightly woven together, where you can go look at Fort Pickens, for instance, where there is 120 years of military history, and that's not counting the Spanish colonial period that's not very far away. And 10 minutes later, you walk across the island and you're out on a beach, and you can forget all about the fort and just be taken in with the beauty of the beach, which you can look at for the unique plants and animals that are living out there, or you can just sit there and soak up the sun. I had a visitor this summer who had just come from some of the big national parks, where he was out during their busy season, and there are lots and lots of people around. And I had a small group of people at one of our little historic units at Battery 234, and he said, it's just so mellow here. It's just so nice that you can get away. So There are a lot of wonderful areas in the national park system, but Gulf Island certainly ranks up there with the best of them.
And you're right, some of the, is it Yellowstone or Yosemite, they've had to block car traffic for part of the year, and you can only get in via a tram, a bus, or something like that, and that's sure not the case here. Earl, Bob?
Well, they are heavily visited, all the national parks today. I really think the American people have discovered them. Gulf Islands is certainly high visitation, but David is absolutely right. You've got I envisioned in the beginning that Pensacola Harbor itself could be a national park, with the old Navy Yard, Fort Barrancas, the site of Fort McRae, and Fort Pickens, and then we added those 14 miles of Santa Rosa Island to make it a national seashore. And we got the best of all worlds here. I read a report in 1955 by the Interior Department when I was writing editorials that said there was no public beach left in Florida. There was very little, small percentage of public beach left in Florida in 1955. Well, you can imagine what it is today. And that kind of spurred me on what they had done at Cape Cod and what Lyndon Johnson had done at Padre Island, to set aside this wonderful beaches and prevent the condominiums. I would say that if we had not established Gulf Islands between Pensacola Beach and Navarre Beach, that whole area owned by the county would probably be just a series of towers all the way down the way. There would be very little public beach left. And that's one of the reasons that I worked so hard with a lot of good people to bring this about, preserve it in its natural state.
There'd be so many people there that we really couldn't, nobody could enjoy it, really. What do you think of President Teddy Roosevelt said that humans naturally seem to want to change things? And you're talking about something here that can only be changed by people, really for the worse, don't you think? Right. And that must cause reflection in you as you look at this. You say, how are we going to keep this from being changed? David?
Well, the great challenge of the National Park Service has always been trying to balance preservation and use. And it's one of the reasons why we try to do things as carefully as we do, because it is not just a preserve for the animals or just to have a building set aside that you can come look at from a distance. The point of the national parks is to have, as Teddy Roosevelt said, pleasuring ground for the people. It belongs to the people, and the people have to be able to come and get to them. The challenge is to allow the people to come in such a way that it does not damage the resource. And it is a constant challenge, and we battle amongst ourselves with how best to balance it, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Limit access, Gail?
Right. You know, some areas of the park are considered wilderness. They're national wilderness islands, and those are located over in our Mississippi district. And they have the strictest preservation standards for those wilderness areas. So, you know, we do have a mix of places you can get to readily by your own car, you can get there by boat, or, you know, you can sail out. But that is that's the balance. And one thing we want to do is have resources in places like Gulf Islands for generations to come.
You probably get tired of being asked about Geronimo, most famous prisoner that was ever probably at the fort. And I understand that his being there was kind of, it was early Florida tourism to get people to come to the Pensacola area because they could, you know, they have him on display. And isn't that something that Geronimo became an early tourist attraction, and that was how he happened to end up here. Do I have that right?
That's right. And David knows better than I, but I think Pensacolians went and appealed to bring Geronimo here. They saw it as an opportunity, and there were a lot of famous people during his stay at Pickens who came here on their yachts to see him because he was a national celebrity. And they had sent most of the women and children to St. Augustine, to that Fort Marion there. But we got Geronimo, but I forget the time he stayed, but one night they snuck him out in the dark of night to Alabama, and he went back to Oklahoma ultimately. But he was, it's said to be one of the first, and I think the early thinking was that he would be a tourist attraction and try to attract business to this area.
Otherwise, the women and children, the families, Geronimo's Apache tribe, would have all been sent together over to Fort Marion.
Yes.
So wasn't it rather cruel to put the men over here and send their families?
It was, but it didn't stay that way for all that long, and they were only here for about a year and a half. The Army was in kind of an odd situation since Geronimo had been requested, but there were over 400 Chiricahua and Warm Springs Apaches that were being transported to Fort Marion, what is actually Castillo de San Marcos, although the Army called it Fort Marion. And the request was just for Geronimo, so being somewhat bureaucratic perhaps, the Army just, as the train was coming through Pensacola anyway, they just unloaded the last car essentially, which had Geronimo and 16 or 17 other men. And then the rest of the tribe went on where they were going to. And Geronimo and the other men did complain bitterly about being separated from their families. So the Army pulled the tribe out of St. Augustine after 6 months because the situation there was pretty unhealthy, and moved them to Mount Vernon, Alabama. And on the way back through, they did drop off the wives and children of the men who were at Fort Pickens. So the families were reunited for the last 12 months that they were there. In fact, one of Geronimo's wives died during that stay at Fort Pickens, and there was a child born to Perico and his family.
But it's really what a different time it was in America. I mean, it's appalling to think today that we take pull Geronimo, we pull somebody in, put him in a place for a tourist attraction, and he's a prisoner. Isn't that wild to think that the country once did that?
Well, it was interesting to read the newspaper accounts when they were arguing about bringing Geronimo. One editor said they ought to put it in ought to keep Geronimo in the office of the competing newspaper editor's office, so he could be the first one he would scalp. Well, the Apaches didn't scalp anybody. But Geronimo is an interesting story in its own right. He was a prisoner of war for 25 years, held a prison and died a prisoner of war, but he had a lot of attention paid to him later on.
Well, Earl Bowden, father of the Gulf Islands National Seashore, appreciate your being here. Gail Bishop, you do such good work there, and we appreciate you too, and David Ogden. We'll be seeing more of these people in the upcoming documentary that WSRE has produced about the Gulf Island National Seashore. It's a real beauty, and you won't want to miss it. For more information on it, of course, you can go to our website, WSRE.org, and there'll be connections to the links to the National Seashore and a lot of other great things. So please check that out and check out the documentary too. Thank you for watching this evening. I'm Lloyd Patterson for WSRE. Good night.